Welcome to our panel of the last day here of our seminar. This is a panel on the book How to Know a Person by David Brooks. I'm not going to say much about it because Dr. Crosby is going to go ahead and present it and why we've selected this text for discussion at this seminar. So without further ado, I will turn it over to our panelists.
Okay. Thank you, Christopher. Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
It was my idea to John Henry that we make some use of this book of David Brooks. This is How to Know a Person, with the interesting subtitle, The Art of Seeing Others Deeply and Being Deeply Seen. David Brooks is a columnist for the New York Times, and he often flies under the flag of personalism. Some years ago in the Times, he wrote a column entitled Personalism, the Philosophy That We Need. So he consciously identifies with personalism and takes personalism especially under a certain communitarian aspect, capturing this ordination of persons one to another. Now, it's not a book of great philosophic profundity. He talks about empathy in one chapter. He doesn't deal with it in the philosophically profound way that Edith Stein treats of empathy in her doctoral dissertation. But still, it's a voice in the culture that seems to me to be saying something significant, something that resonates with many of us. And like Michael Healy is always trying to find voices in the musical popular culture that express something worth discussing. So here David Brooks seems to me to have written, for a large popular audience, but with elements of real wisdom along the way. So let me just first say something about the main idea in the book as I see it, and then raise some problems, philosophical problems with the way Brooks has presented his insights. So the book is dominated by the idea that there is nothing quite so distressing and painful for a human being as to go unnoticed as person, to be ignored, to be treated as if one didn't exist. That way of dealing with persons is devastating. It's destructive. Inflicted on a child at an early age, you can have disabilities there of mind and heart that one never recovers from. So his idea is that seeing a person, seeing them as a person, not just seeing some stereotypical substitute, but seeing them as this concrete person, has a great life-giving power. Just as ignoring them is devastating, so seeing them as the persons they are breathes a kind of life, lets them come to themselves, lets them somehow experience their own personhood and their own worth. Actually, the main thought in Brooks is one that I tried to bring out in my address last year in the summer seminar. I quoted Ratzinger as saying that this sense of worth that we need is something that no one can give to himself. There's a primordial sense of worth that I have to receive as a gift given to me by another. And with that important thought of Ratzinger, you have simply a perhaps profounder and more Christian rendering of the main intuition, as I see it, of the book by David Brooks. So let me just read a couple of sentences here expressing this primary intuition of the book. Human beings need recognition as much as they need food and water. no crueler punishment can be devised than not to see someone, to render them unimportant or invisible. The worst sin toward our fellow creatures is not to hate them, George Bernard Shaw wrote, but to be indifferent to them. That's the essence of inhumanity. To do that is to say, you don't matter. You don't even exist. In a very interesting passage, later on in the book, he examines the testimony given by some of these shooters that have emerge and begin shooting wildly and destructively, murderously, children in a school. And Brooks studied the mindset of these shooters and what they subsequently said about themselves. And he claims in every case there was a sense of distressing invisibility, and the attempt was made to do something that caught the attention of others. Of course, it's a perfectly absurd and destructive way of meeting that need of being noticed, but that need had gone unmet to the point that this kind of senseless violence could break out of them. So this life-giving power of being seen is expressed here on page 11. Partly it was included in the section we passed out to you. No one can fully appreciate their own beauty and strength unless these things are mirrored back to them in the mind of another. There is something in being seen that brings forth growth. If you beam the light of your attention on me, I blossom. And the thought is elaborated in Ratzinger a little more deeply, that if you see that your existence is a gift, that it's good that you exist. Well, that's a realization that you cannot give yourself. You cannot just think, well, I am a creature of God, I have this worth. You have to receive that affirmation of your personhood from another, and from another who gives it to you in love for you. That's what can empower you to gratefully receive the gift of your own existence. Yeah, so I would just point out one other passage before I turn to some critical questions that I want to put to David Brooks. He refers to the famous book by Ralph Ellison, Invisible Man. And Ralph Ellison was a black writer writing about the predicament of black men and women in our society. He writes, Ellison's words at the start of Invisible Man still rank as one of the most profound expressions of what it is like not to feel seen, heard, or understood, in this case because of race. I am invisible simply because people refuse to see me, the nameless narrator declares. It is as though I have been surrounded by mirrors of hard, distorting glass. When they approach me, they see only my surroundings, themselves, or figments of their imagination. Indeed, everything and anything except me. And Ellison writes that a person in this position wonders whether you aren't simply a phantom in other people's minds. Am I real at all when I go so ignored as a person by everyone around me? So this, by the way, may have some interesting connections with the discussion around Professor Burgos's paper. If that's true, that it takes another to let me come to myself, why then the other has an eminent position in my relatedness to that other, and receiving from that other is fundamental and nothing in the way of accidental at all. Well, I would like also, in opening up this discussion, to look at some objections, two in particular. In general, when one turns into the inwardness and subjectivity of the person, as Brooks does, the danger is falling into some kind of subjectivism. And I think that happens in a couple of places. And I say this out of admiration for Brooks, wanting to make his project clearer, cleaner, more effective than it already is. So, one problematic tendency in the book is treatment of universal moral norms. He has really mainly scorn for universal norms on the grounds that they so readily lead to stereotyping and to being insensitive to the texture, the concrete texture of moral situations. And so he writes, over the centuries, male writers and philosophers like Immanuel Kant have built these vast moral systems that portray moral life as something that disinterested, rational individuals do by adhering to abstract universal principles, such as always treat human beings as an end in themselves and not as a means to something else. His example is the personalist principle itself, as John Paul called it. And then Brooks writes with some exasperation in his tone of voice, that emphasis on abstract universal principles is fine, I suppose, but it's impersonal and decontextualized. It's not about how this one unique person should encounter another unique person. It's as if these philosophers were so interested in coming up with coherent abstract principles and philosophically impregnable systems that they are afraid of particular people, messy creatures that we are, and the messy situations we find ourselves in. So by taking seriously basic moral norms like never using a person as a mere means, we lose our contact with the concrete texture of moral situations. And I just have to protest against that, to have this general moral principle, never to use persons as mere means, to have that at your disposal, to understand it, to try to live by it, is a very great asset in leading a moral life that fully respects persons. What Brooks rightly sees is that in a given concrete case, you may wonder, is this way of treating another really using them or not? When I buy something at Kroger and talk to the checkout clerk, am I using her as a mere means to complete the transaction? Or is there a way of extending some kind of kindness that blocks that depersonalization and somehow does treat even the checkout clerk as person? So there's the need for a lot of sensitivity, and just having an abstract principle doesn't help you discriminate wisely, as to where the line is crossed between not using and using persons. So I'm still leaving plenty of room for that sensitivity to the concrete that is so important to Brooks. But at the same time, it seems to me very important once I see, yes, this does cross the line. This is an ugly using of another person. Then I need for that universal law never to use persons as means. I need for that to kick in and to give me direction in my acting. So he slides into a caricature of universal norms that, and also he doesn't seem to have much patience for the different virtues, individual virtues like reverence, courage, truthfulness, gratitude, He inveighs against what he calls essentialism, as if you're just taking some kind of abstract form when you talk about these virtues and imposing it insensitively on individual persons. And so there too, I think one has to say there is certainly a form, an essential form of reverence. Who's explained that better than von Hildebrand himself? And what that is in the concrete, that's a challenge to our ethical wisdom. But what it is essentially, as laid out at the beginning of Hildebrand's The Art of Living, that as a universal moral insight has its lasting value. And that seems to be lost on Brooks. I said there were two problems that I see in Brooks. Here's the other second one. And it comes, Derek rightly pointed out to me, pages 62 to 70 as the most problematic passage in the book. There, oh yeah, very good. All right, I will. So be advised, there is another problem in Brooks
I'll talk
that
about
he calls constructionism.
I will discuss that. Yeah.
And which he sums up like this. I'll just say this much, Christopher. We do not see things as they are. We see things as we are. That's problematic. We'll discuss those problems in the Q&A.
All right, thank you. You hear me all right? Okay, good. Well, as I've been traveling in the 2 weeks prior to the seminar, I wasn't able to acquire a hard copy of Brooks's book, so I was forced to listen to him narrate his book on Audible, which is not entirely ideal for me, being a more visual rather than auditory learner. I tend to struggle with keeping track of names, details, those sorts of things. This is something my wife knows about me pretty well. She can't give me turn-by-turn directions ahead of time when we are driving in the car. She has to tell me, turn right now, turn left now, otherwise I'm liable to turn left, then right, then another right, and forget entirely where we're going. That's my caveat, that I may jumble things up a little bit in my own understanding and impressions of Brooks. So take that as the pinch of salt as we engage in a little bit of critical reflection on Brooks's analysis of how to know persons. With that caveat, though, I would like to take some time to critically engage with what seems to me to be one of the central themes of Brooks's work on persons. And being a Steinian, it shouldn't be a surprise that that theme that I want to take a close look at is the theme of empathy. And this is partly why John Henry also asked me to address that theme. Now, in a lot of ways, I think one could make the argument that Stein, writing over a century ago, has preempted quite a bit of Brooks's argument about empathy in the book. Empathy being the ability to perceive the inner lives and experience of others, and its central importance for the project of coming to know persons, including coming to know oneself. Now, like Brooks, Stein sees the necessity of holding oneself open for the experience of an other as a distinct mark of a developed personality, indeed as the condition of developing one's own personality, which at a certain level is impossible without development in empathy and empathic correction from without. We get a better sense of who we are, more often than not, by seeing how others see us. Nevertheless, while there are many points of convergence between Stein and Brooks, there are also quite a few fundamental divergences and disagreements as well. Although the theme of empathy is present in How to Know a Person from the very beginning of the book, and is deployed quite insightfully throughout its early parts, often without explicit reference to the concept of empathy, We are only introduced to the language of empathy and to a sustained treatment of it in part 2 of the book, in the chapter on the art of empathy. In that chapter, in which Brooks begins to draw upon some psychological and social scientific concepts of empathy, certain philosophical problems begin to emerge that seem to undermine much of what is positive in the argument of the book up until that point. Consequently, I would like to take some time to examine first what I take to be positive in the argument, and second, to examine how Brooks's treatment of empathy in part 2 and its alignment with the theory of constructivism, which John just mentioned, and the merely projective theory of empathy ultimately undermine his whole project. Brooks's main thesis, as I understand it, seems to be that personal development is something that can only be accomplished the more we open ourselves up to encounter with and knowledge of others. He initially frames this argument in a narrative, autobiographical form, in recounting something of his own life and his often diminished sense of his own personality that he captures in the emotionlessness of his responses to his world, those around him, etc., which only began to resolve the more he learned, although he does not quite put it this way, to empathize with others. It's that ability which enabled him more and more to respond in emotionally adequate ways to his world, himself, and to those around him. Beyond the outlines of his own autobiography, as he sketches it in his introduction, Brooks gives similar examples that serve to illustrate the same point throughout the book. Two that struck me most potently were the story of a couple contemplating separation who rediscover and deepen their love for each other while unexpectedly serving others in the aftermath of the tsunami in Indonesia in 2004. The second story is the story of Brooks' accompaniment of his friend who is suffering from debilitating depression. In the first, we hear the story of a couple growing increasingly apart, largely because the man whose name I forget, these are the kinds of details that get jumbled up as I listen, and also when I meet people, I'm horrible with names. He can't seem to connect emotionally with his girlfriend. As he watches her ministering to the family who have lost their child and the young wife who is searching for her missing husband, and as he sees each one of these people wrestling with their sufferings, their hopes, and their efforts to support each other from giving way into despair, the man's personality opens up. He's more able to engage with life than he was before, and in this he discovers his real ability to love his girlfriend in a way that he was not quite able to before. Through empathy, the man becomes more capable of engaging with the world around him, and through empathy, he consequently becomes more fully himself. While the story of Brooks's friend suffering from depression is not quite as positive in its results as the previous story, as the friend ultimately commits suicide, Brooks' struggle to empathize with his friend, to accompany him, and his empathy with his friend's surviving wife and children highlight some of these same thematic elements. In this encounter with depression, the depth of which Brooks struggles to comprehend, leading him to accompany his friend in often quite bumbling and unproductive ways, leads to a development of Brooks' own personality as he strives and gradually becomes more understanding, less bumbling, and overall more caring as a person, more grateful for the gift of life, etc. These and similar anecdotes throughout the book illustrate a key insight that Stein, in her doctoral dissertation on the problem of empathy, had already developed in a more explicitly philosophical way. As Stein puts the point, in coming to empathize with the lived experience of others, of the foreign personality, as she puts it, we can not only learn to make ourselves into objects, as she writes, but through empathy with related natures, that is, persons of our type, what is sleeping in us is developed. Now, what she means by related natures or persons of our type is that persons, for all of our individuality, have often fairly typical ways of living and being in the world. We access those typicalities through empathy, and in doing so can recognize the structure of personalities in their individuality. Their characteristic acts that display personality can be grouped according to the regularity of their structures into types, so that we recognize in a person a scholarly type or an artistic type. These typological forms of personality, of course, represent generalities that do not capture the whole of the person's individuality or the core of personality, as Stein will put it. Yet they slowly allow us to adumbrate the individual core of the person and to encounter them in all of their incommunicable and unrepeatable richness. In either case, though, in empathizing with the other who has a type that is more similar and thus more comprehensible to our own, we begin to awaken possibilities that are initially dormant in our own personality. Or to use language that will be quite typical of her thought, empathizing in this way helps us to unfold the latent possibilities of our personality. This is all the more so, however, when we are empathizing not only with persons who are of our same type, but when we encounter persons who are developed in ways that are not reflected in our own typical modes of living and being in the world. That is, as Stein puts it, since the experience of value is basic to our own value, at the same time as new values are acquired in conscious experience by empathy with others, our own unfamiliar values become visible. When we empathically run into ranges of values closed to us but available to another, we become conscious of our own deficiency of disvalue. Stein gives the clearest example of this in the immediately preceding section of the chapter, where she describes her own, at the time, atheistic encounter in empathy with a person, such as her teacher Adolf Reinach, who is a type of the homo religiosus, the religious man. Such a man might, as she puts it, sacrifice all his earthly goods to his faith. And she writes, I see him behave in this way and empathize a value experiencing as the motive for his conduct. Although at this juncture in her life, Stein expects that that value would always remain unfulfilled for her, still she sees the ways in which fulfilling it would develop new levels of her personality, and even recognize the sort of moral obligation imposed on her to develop it in this way if possible. The point in either case, however, is that empathy is a primordially fundamental key for personality, and especially for ethical development. And this is a point on which both Stein and Brooks can agree. The point of divergence, though, between Stein and Brooks occurs in his naive acceptance of the theory of constructivism. Brooks makes clear at various points that he accepts the naive assumptions of contemporary neuroscience, which are naive, of course, not because their results or data are false, but because the philosophical framework within which it interprets those results are unthought and unquestioned. He presumes that the research proves that the world is a colorless, odorless, textureless space in which each of us actively constructs our world as we perceive it and live it through a network of perceptions, interpretations, etc. The basic assumptions here are rooted in Kantian phenomenalism, and while there are important insights in Kant's view, they are challenged and problematized in phenomenology, which against constructivism prefers the language of constitution, or the idea that experience occurs in ways that still allow the world to give itself to us as colored, full of odors, sounds, and shot through with values. Although we encounter such phenomena only within our subjective lived experience, it is precisely because those lived experience are empathically open and reiterable that the world is given as an objective world for all. Not, as Brooks has it, as a sort of set of parallel constructs where each person has their own individually constructed world, period. Getting to know a person is not getting to know the world that they construct, although this is how Brooks understands it, but rather understanding the peculiar value, openness, or closeness from which the person encounters in a more or less adequate way the one world for all, and especially in its value dimensions. Because of this, Brooks is forced to consider empathy as a kind of act of projection of myself upon the other, comparing my previous experience with that of the other, but which has the effect of actually, contrary to Brooks's intention, closing the other off from us. We see ourselves in the other, not the other allowing us to see ourselves. This, I think, is the deep deficiency of Brooks's effort.
Good morning. I went to the University of Chicago, the College of the University of Chicago, and then did my graduate work there as well. And David Brooks was a few years ahead of me, and we never really knew each other, but we existed in a very similar environment, a very educational environment. So I've always enjoyed reading his column and watching him on PBS. We had some professors in common and things like that. And I do agree with Professor Crosby that there are some positive features of this book, and the one that he mentioned is particularly noteworthy, this idea that not being recognized is a terrible, terrible thing for a person. However, I'm going to be much more critical. I mean, it seems like we've already had some criticisms, but I'm going to be somewhat combative in relation to this book because I think there are a lot of difficulties with it. And so I want to start by just talking about what he says about the soul. Then I'm going to switch over to his discussion of the brain, neuroscience, and this term that's already been mentioned, constructivism. Then I'm going to ask, what difference does this all make? Because this is a popular book. It seems a little unfair for philosophers to sort of picayune objections. I think it makes a big difference. I think the things that I'm going to talk about undermine the entire argument. And in a popular forum, this can be very confusing to people, that we ought to try to correct these distortions. So I want to start off on page 31, early in the text. This is what David Brooks says. Now, you may be an atheist, an agnostic, a Christian, a Jew, a Muslim, a Buddhist, or something else. But this posture of respect and reverence, this awareness of the infinite dignity of each person you meet, is a precondition for seeing people well. You may find the whole idea of God ridiculous, but I ask you to believe in the concept of a soul. Then he goes on to talk a bit about this soul, but first of all, it doesn't come up much at all in the rest of the book. If you look at the index, a few places, and he doesn't really talk about the soul. But there's a little bit of problem almost immediately, this is very early on in the text, appealing to all these different people and saying that they understand that we have a soul, particularly the Buddhists. I hate to say, but I have taught Buddhists and spent time teaching Buddhism, and Buddhists tend to reject the idea of a soul. There's a 1,000-year debate between the Buddhists and other Indian thinkers. It's an extraordinary philosophical debate whether or not there is an Atman. Non-Indian philosophers say there is. Buddhists reject that concept in really sophisticated ways. So this all sounds very good. I certainly endorse the concept of human dignity, but this kind of appeal to all these different people who supposedly believe it is almost immediately problematic. But then you get to the chapter that should interest everybody here. What is a person? And that starts on page 55. And here, first of all, we get a lot of neuroscience, a lot of appeals to neuroscience. I spent a little bit of time around neuroscientists, and I'm almost immediately suspicious when we get all of this appeals by laypersons. I don't hardly understand neuroscience. It's an extremely complicated, beautiful field developing, and since the 1990s, which is called the age of the brain, where we got more technology, we've heard endless renditions of what neuroscience allegedly shows, and some of them are just kind of absurd. So immediately my heckles were kind of up here. But then we just get a whole discussion of what the brain does. The brain does this, the brain does that. And it seems like what we call in philosophy a materialism, that we are just material, and the modern form of materialism is we are just our brains. Now, I'm not going to lay out the problems with this position. In my view, they are deep and profound, and this is something that we ought to avoid, this problem of philosophical materialism. But then we get this unusual word that has already been noted, constructivism, where the brain, first is the brain organizes this amorphous reality in all kinds of different ways, not the person again, but the brain does. And in my view, this is a disaster. In terms of epistemology and knowledge. And I want to recommend a text which I believe is back there, which is Dietrich von Hildebrand's What is Philosophy? And the first chapter of that is What is Knowledge? And what he warns correctly, I think, is anytime you get this kind of language of production or construction, just be careful. because it might go in certain kinds of directions. I think he does a very good job of showing that that is gravely deficient. So these are just a few of the problems. It's been pointed out that empathy, his account of empathy, is very troubling. There's so many other places in this book where I don't really know what to say about his treatment. Now, what difference does this make? You might say, there they go again, those philosophers, making distinctions, and we do make lots of distinctions, but come on, the guy wrote a general book, and it's a popular book, and he's sort of on the right track, and that's a good thing. We should encourage him. I guess I'm not as nice as Professor Crosby. He's very gentle and wonderful. I want to say that it's not a good thing that these good ideas are defended in such a deficient way. I think the entire project is undermined by his materialism, by these strange comments about it's an empty world. I mean, to me, it sounds rather sophomoric. We live in this world and there's no meaning to it, and we give it. And it was said that he uses Kantian categories. I think that's a compliment. Uses Kantian. I mean, this sounds like a sophomoric understanding of existentialism, or the comments about the personalistic norm, I think, are just not particularly informed. So I want to say that this is just falls apart. The entire project falls apart, and for that reason, I would like to see something else. So I want to end here. We spent almost a week together talking about the complexities of personalism. It's, for me, been a wonderful seminar. And what I want to say is that I think personalism of the kind that's discussed here at this seminar is a very distinctive position. It's in dialogue with Thomistic traditions in wonderful ways. It's in dialogue with medieval traditions. But it has its own ideas, and I want to encourage other people to consider those ideas, to go out and say, this is a very somewhat minority position within philosophy that doesn't really bother me, but I want them to come out and think about what a person really is. And I'm inspired by this morning's talk on Karl Wojtyła. It was wonderful, sort of a rich understanding of what a person is and a subject is. Dietrich von Hildebrand, Edith Stein, all of these people. So I think it's important for us to come out and not just be a gentle correction, but sometimes opposition. I thought to Professor Burgos, your discussion of that, sometimes one has to be a bit stronger on this. And I'm hoping that someone will write a better popular book on personalism. So thank you, everybody.
All right, thank you to our panelists. We're all looking forward to Derek's book on a more popular personalism. Unless maybe, John, you want to volunteer Dr. Crosby to write it. But I think this is a very, very important question, and I've been really looking forward to hearing what all of you had to say about this. I sympathize with a lot of these criticisms, and I too, as we were discussing a moment ago, thought when we started the book, it started off kind of great. I had high hopes, and then it sort of descends a little bit, and you don't quite deliver on them. And yet, I do think it has kind of started a discussion amongst a lot of people, and I think that's been very valuable. I was mentioning that, I've been at dinner parties where this book is the leading topic for conversation, and we're asking questions about persons and how to know persons, and I don't know what else we would have been talking about, but could have very likely have been politics, and so this is at least better than that. Well, curious what you all think. So we'll turn it over to Q&A now, and we'll have some remarks at the end of the session as well. We have some questions.
Did you want to say anything?
Oh yeah,
Dr. Crosby, as the champion of this book, before we go to?
That's true. Yeah, would you like to respond to Derek?
Perhaps just one response regarding Brooks's openness to all of these philosophical positions that he wants to enlist in his personalism, the atheist, the Buddhist, and the rest. And I would, by way of response, recall the situation in 1947 when the United Nations drew up its Declaration on Human Rights. Jacques Maritain, who's been mentioned here before, was active in that work of drafting the Declaration on Human Rights. And Maritain, in writing about the experience, said he was amazed at how all the participants, and there were Buddhists and non-believers and the same groups that Derek mentions, and each of them would explain why we have certain rights, like a right to life. Each would explain it in a radically different way. And in discussions, they couldn't reach any agreement on how to explain the correct grounding of these rights. But, Maritain said, it was amazing we could agree on very many rights. All the ones that they're listed in the Declaration on Human Rights were concurred in by people with all of these divergent worldviews and divergent ways of ultimately explaining. And so I think here too it may be that we can have a significant concurrence on what it is to see a person, how you do violence to a person by looking past them or failing to see them or ignoring them. We may get a wide concurrence even though the people concurring have fundamentally divergent views on what a person is and whether a person even exists, like you say, the Buddhists raise. But the intuitive recognition of a reality like basic human rights or personhood is one thing. The ultimate theoretical account for it is another. And the wide disagreement on the latter doesn't prevent us from having significant agreement on the former. So that, by way of explaining why I'm not so troubled by Brooks wanting to engage the atheists and the Buddhists in his discourse.
Yes, I certainly have a great deal of respect for Jacques Maritain. I'm quite familiar with this debate about the Human Rights Convention, and it's a beautiful thing that he said. But this here is about the soul, and I've just spent too much time. One of my dissertation advisors was a specialist in Buddhism, knew all of the languages, and then I taught Buddhist monks, and it's a secondary specialty. I'm not an expert. I don't read Sanskrit or Pali, but this issue of the soul is so fundamental, and there are many Buddhists who say we affirm human rights, but we can't really affirm the soul. And so if we're talking about human rights, there might be more agreement. It's kind of a civil law and a good thing, but not something so deep as the soul. And it's kind of typical of so much of this book, is just throwing out these kinds of superficial observations about really important matters. And as I said, this was a 1,000-year debate in India. Beautiful and remarkable debate about is there a soul? So perhaps human rights, and I applaud that. We have to seek out commonalities. I entirely endorse that. But you get deeper into these matters of the soul, I'm just not so sure that everybody would say, yeah, there's a divine spark in everybody. I just don't think that's the case.
I wonder if we can, I think this is obviously a very important point, but even if we back up a little more to the introductory points that Brooks wants to make in this book, can we find a little more consensus there? I do think we at least find some resonance with some of the things we've been talking about already, which I wanted to highlight as we go into the Q&A. Like in this section we read, Brooks says, many of our national problems arise from the fraying of our social fabric. If we want to begin repairing the big national ruptures, we have to learn to do the small things well. Referencing on the previous page, he says, the minute interactions of daily life. So I think that this, obviously there's much to be worked out in what that means, but if we could look back to the panel yesterday on integralism and many of the discussions on forming communities, this emphasis at least on like small solutions to big problems and personal solutions to systemic problems, that seems, I think, at least to be consonant, and perhaps that can also help guide our questions. Any other comments from our panelists before we turn it over?
Well, I'd like to respond to that. I think that that's right. That it's very. I think it is very easy for us to find a lot of agreement with the basic impulses that Brooks brings to this book and to the discussion of the themes that, as you said, we've been touching on throughout the week. But I think that to Derek's point, he does make certain very superficial philosophical moves and enlists in a very superficial way a host of philosophical and other kinds of theories that I think end up burdening the argument of the book, not just in ways that make sort of the question of theoretical coherence difficult, that is, that there are tensions and contradictions at the theoretical level, but I think it actually has some practical impacts as well. And particularly the theory of empathy that he weds himself to, I think that it does end up derailing the practical efforts that he tries to make. In teaching us how to get to know persons, I think that if we follow his advice to us, we won't actually get to know persons.
We have questions from Mark and Amanda. Yeah.
Thank you all. Thank you to all of you. This isn't on. Is it on? Okay. John, I want to go back to the thing you said in your initial remarks about Brooks's critique of universal moral norms, especially this principle that we should respect persons as ends and not means. And I'm wondering if the personalist, especially the Hildebrandian personalist, should be a little more sympathetic to Brooks than you allowed. Here's what I'm thinking. So it seems like to move from a society in which we tend to use people to a society in which we respect persons as ends and not means is a great advance and not to be dismissed. But it seems that the Hildebrandian personalist might be asking us to go further to a society built on the idea that we should not merely respect persons as ends, but that we should love persons and value persons as incarnations of unique values. So the worry might be something like a society built on the abstract Kantian principle treats all persons as entirely equivalent to one another, whereas a personalist, while not rejecting that by any means, would ask us to go deeper.
Yeah.
And I'd like to know what you think about that.
Yeah. No, that's a very good extension of what I was saying. You're linking up with the formulation that Wojtyła gives in Love and Responsibility of the personalist principle, not just that persons are never to be used as means, but affirmanda propter se ipsum, so to be loved for their own sakes. And that fuller account of seeing and loving a person, that's needed. I completely concur. That would be a more abundant account of this respect for persons and this will to see persons as they are and not just be content with cheap stereotypes. So, no, I welcome that comment for expanding the scope of what I was saying.
Professor Spencer, I do agree with you and what Professor Crosby said, but you don't get to those insights by having superficial broadsides against the great Kant. Kant is one of the great thinkers in philosophy, lots of problems with him. One of the things I very much appreciate about personalism, at least that's as it's embodied by people like Professor Crosby or Joseph Seifert and others, is Kant is problematic, or Descartes is problematic, or Aristotle is problematic, but these people have really great insights. And I spent too much time studying these thinkers to the Cartesian this, or the Aristotelian this. So I just don't think I read that and I just said, this is terrible. The poor Kant who's been gone a long time, but he's a great mind.
Yeah, I would agree in a sense with both or all three views expressed. I would say before there was Wojtyła commenting on this, and before there was von Hildebrand commenting on this, it was also Shaler, who in the second part of the formalism, he opens up the discussion with a little commentary on this personalistic principle of Kant's, and how and although he says he respects the the deep intuition there, about the necessity of treating persons as ends, and how Kant's trying to preserve the dignity of the person in this, that the formalistic, sort of universalistic way in which it's framed ends up being depersonalizing. So I think that Brooks does have maybe an intuition in that direction, that persons have to be addressed as persons, which means not as mere replaceable instances of a kind, of a universal kind, but they have to be treated individually. But I think that at the same time I agree with Derek that this Brooks has a tendency to do what I think a lot of journalists do, that really rubs me the wrong way quite a bit, which is to sort of engage in a sort of psychologizing of their subject, where they think that they're clarifying something by peeling the layer back on the inner psyche of the person they're writing about. In this case, Kant being afraid of these certain things. And I think that impulse, again, shows us a little bit of the practical burdens under which Brooks is laboring as he's, I think, both individually, sort of narratively, autobiographically, struggling to get to know persons, and as he's trying to instruct us on the practicalities of getting to know persons, that in fact he's a lot of times projecting certain expectations of what's going on in the psyche of the other, rather than allowing the other to disclose themselves for themselves. And in and through that, getting to know the person, and in and through that, opening himself up to both know persons and to know himself. So I think that's the limitation here.
Amanda?
This is mainly a question for Derek and John. So the What is a Person chapter that you brought up, Derek, ends with the sentence, George Bernard Shaw got it right. Life isn't about finding yourself. Life is about creating yourself. On the one hand, we in this room might kind of balk at that. But on the other hand, Wojtyła says something seemingly similar when he says, it's man's actions, his conscious acting, that make him who and what he actually is. Of course, with Hildebrand, we have this integration of the objective and subjective dimensions, but what I want to point to is that Brooks shares so many anecdotes and experiences throughout this book, and that's what contributes to it being popular, and I'm sure in many cases resonant for people. So what I want to ask is, how can we draw out and receive and work with people's anecdotes and experiences to lead them toward what we might estimate as a more correct understanding of things?
Yeah. Shall I go?
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think when we see a disparity between, like, what seems to be Brooks's materialism, a disparity between that and his sense of persons and the unconditional respect due to persons, I think there's an opportunity there to seize upon that respect that he has and show him, lead him back to a deeper understanding of the self and the soul. Use this personalist wisdom that he often shows to mount an argument against the materialism that he sometimes slides into. So the positive elements, I think, can be taken as a point of departure, for trying to disabuse Brooks of the serious weaknesses. But I think I keep coming back to this idea that people can have really deep, significant insights into the person, even though there's a lot of confusion on the theoretical level. And to come in and say, well, because of this theoretical confusion, we're throwing it all out, is a bit reckless. Let me give you an example. Viktor Frankl, everybody knows Viktor Frankl, logotherapy, calls itself a personalist kind of psychology. We can all learn immeasurably much from the witness of Viktor Frankl, his experience in the concentration camps. One of the great figures of the 20th century, a magnificent moral exemplar. But I had the chance to talk with Frankl. He was a visitor of the International Academy of Philosophy in Liechtenstein, where I was for a time. And we discovered, to our astonishment, Frankl did not believe in the immortality of the soul. He thought that the only immortality that we have is the remembrance of our deeds, that everything that was done, for good and bad, is eternally remembered. The fact that it happened can't be undone, not even by God itself. So there's a kind of eternity in our history. And that irreversibility, that's the immortality of the soul. But a living immortality of concrete persons, that the great Viktor Frankl couldn't see, astonishingly enough. And so I would say, in discussion with him, we tried to point out, these intimations of immortality that were there in his own relation to the camp guards. And so I think to you, I would say, let's not be appalled at something really muddled in a thinker. Let's see what he saw, and maybe what he saw can be developed so as to counteract the mischief of his errors.
I have always admired Professor Crosby in this way that he proceeds, and it's inspired me many times. And so I would appreciate and endorse a lot of what he just said. But for me, sometimes the intellectual life, as our good friend Paul Griffiths says, he's a mentor, Catholic, originally a Buddhist scholar. Sometimes the intellectual life is both agonistic and antagonistic, meaning that sometimes it's a sharp exchange of ideas. Antagonism, this gets back to the opposition. Sometimes people don't have goodwill. And so I would move the person, as Professor Crosby said, toward insight. But if there are some things that are really problematic, not morally problematic, like the person is a horrible person, but philosophically problematic, I might really put a little bit of pressure on that idea. And so, because I think there's some productivity to that approach as well. So I think perhaps I would be a little bit more critical, perhaps, than Professor Crosby is. I generally agree with the way of proceeding, but I think sometimes you just have to say, in your case, Amanda, I mean, issues of euthanasia, and I have a right to take my own life, and euthanasia is a form of compassion. You have to really push at those ideas and say, this is just fundamentally mistaken, and in a way that Professor Crosby, with the goal of moving somebody to insight.
Thanks. We have another question over here.
Yeah, so I wanted to begin by really affirming the value of deep listening that I saw in the excerpt that we were given to read. And I think Dr. Crosby's insight on the importance of what is here is genuine. For some reasons I'll give in a moment. But I also want to acknowledge that the metaphysics here are very, very much problematic, that he cites in support. I will say this. I teach side by side with devout Catholic therapists at Divine Mercy University. And these kinds of listening skills that he has clearly had experience of, to hear him talk, right, have a profound effect on the human nervous system that really help us to feel seen and understood and taken seriously, and are fundamental skills that the therapists must learn in their first semester of training with us, not because they are therapeutic skills, but because they are human relating skills. One possible author for following up on this a little bit would be to look at the Catholic priest and psychotherapist Adrian van Kam, The Art of Existential Counseling, which is a text that we do use in that training. I can't speak to all the metaphysics that may be implicit there, but that is one source that we have found very helpful. And I can attest from being personally involved in the using the training of these skills for our spiritual director trainees. We train them in the same skills that the therapists are trained in, that when you can speak to another person and be present to them in a way that is soft and slow and low and takes a genuine interest in the other person, they are able to bring more of themselves into the conversation And some of that has to do with bypassing our fight or flight mechanism that is a natural part of how we are when we feel threatened. I could say more, but that's probably enough for right now. So I want to affirm your instinct to see the value of this, Dr. Crosby, while also recognizing that the defense given is somewhat inadequate.
Yeah. And I agree with that last point.
When I saw the title, How to Know a Person, I thought a lot more would be said about love. I don't think you know anybody or who or what a person is at all until you've deeply loved somebody. Then, if you acknowledge your love is really valid, there's this objective reality of value and beauty, then you have to conclude there's that secret level of beauty in every person. And then you conclude with C.S. Lewis, there are no ordinary people. And then he goes a step further metaphysically and says, you've never met a mere mortal. But I think it's through love that you come to that more universal and deep acknowledgement of what a person is.
Yeah.
Do you want to comment?
What's that?
Do you want to comment? Or I can comment?
Yeah, the love maybe isn't named as often as we would hope, but I think it's implied in many of the concrete cases that he describes. I think if pressed, he would say, but of course, it's a look at another that is a loving look. That's the only thing that empowers them. I don't think that life-giving look is indifferent to love and hatred in Brooks. But it might have been articulated more distinctly.
However, if love is reducible to brain chemistry, which is the suggestion here, it's not really love. And this is something that appears very early on in The Wonderful Nature of Love. This is the nothing but approach, that it's nothing but this. And he doesn't say that, but I mean, the entire presentation is about the brain doing something. That's not at all close to what love is. And just to respond to something that Steve said, I really appreciate that contribution. I think, I guess the word skill in your fields, that's very important, but he says very early on, I want these skills, and I admire these people, and that's a kind of a techne approach to love and to these other. There are skills, but there's also just a learning how to respond to another person. It's not like a checklist. Well, I got good at this and good at that, and you did that, and I want to add. And for me, there's too much of that. And once again, I'm not commenting on the practice of therapists. That's not, I don't train therapists. But for me as a personalist, it's just a little bit too technically focused.
Yeah, he speaks of the art of empathy in the one chapter, but it's very clear that its art can see very technologically, so to speak, that it's very much about these techniques that you have to employ in order to get to know a person. And yeah, there's this mismatch between what I think is, as John said, in the anecdotes, I think that it's very clear that there is a sort of primacy of love and a primacy of empathy that is involved in the true stories of how people open up in the face of the other and this loving look that for example, the boyfriend that I mentioned in the one anecdote, looking at his girlfriend as she is engaged in selflessly caring for and holding up these others who've lost loved ones in this unexpected tsunami while on vacation in Indonesia that opens him up. So I think it's in the anecdotes, and kind of to get back to Amanda's question earlier, it's in the anecdotes that Brooks really, I think, makes a contribution by stitching together these narratives of how persons encounter each other, that we can really mine the truth of Brooks's work here. And I think that there's good reason for us to say there's a lot of truth there. But then it's this disjunction between the anecdote and the theoretical, and then consequently practical advice that leads, I think, to a lot of deficiencies.
One more question.
Hi, thank you all for your analyses. Now I'm regretting not reading the entire book instead of just the first chapter, especially because of the section on the science of empathy, or his appeals to neuroscience and psychology. And I guess I'm sympathetic to the idea that he did that in a popular book, despite the fact that's not where his project started, because I think a popular audience a lot of times kind of wants an appeal to science. And I think this topic was an ambitious and bad project to start that with, to have science try to substantiate something that's interpersonal, and in some ways was probably something that a really advanced scientist would need to do to interpret those neuroscientific studies. Because there are some really interesting neuroscience studies from Gaese about how can you interpret mirror neurons from somebody else that differentiate the population when I grasp something and a little child grasps something separate from me, that there's a different population of neurons that tells me that's not just me, that's someone else. Some ways that like conquers the projection, I only exist in my mind arguments, but it's deep in a science that a popular author probably would not take. But I think when we're using personalism in a world with a lot of different professions, can a personalist appeal to science in any way? Like, where's the project of a personalist scientist if he were to write a book on empathy? Can he use science at all, or is that always a failed attempt?
I think it's important to think about science, but I would rather do this in dialogue. I was speaking with Professor Spencer about a dialogue we had about brain death, and with a very advanced surgeon, our friend James Beauregard, who's not here this time, and then we got a interesting dialogue and tension. And as I said, for me, at least, neuroscience is so difficult, and to speak so authoritatively about something, I'm not going to do that. And as I said, I have some experience with neuroscientists, very sophisticated people, and so I'd like to have them in the room, the philosopher in the room, and see what we can do about it, not to speak authoritatively about something that, frankly, I don't fully understand.
I would say that there's good precedent for this historically, because I can think of a few examples. Max Scheler was deeply engaged with the science of his day as he's developing his own personalist philosophy. Another, Hedwig Konrad Matzius, whose works are only now beginning to be translated into English, but she was deeply engaged with the science of her day in developing her own personalist philosophy. So I think that this is something that can and should be done. But I think it can and should be done, as Derek said, in dialogue with those who actually know the science. The science of today is, I think, much more advanced and much more difficult for us untrained philosophers to sort of throw ourselves into. But all the more so for a journalist, and it's most often journalists who are doing this sort of philosophizing about the results of science, and doing so in ways that are ultimately extrapolating from the science in ways that the science doesn't actually substantiate. So that's what I think is the trouble.
If I could just I know we're running out of time, but just very quickly add, sometimes this goes in really negative directions as well. In the world that I'm involved with of criminal justice, the use of neuroscience and the use of algorithms. I was speaking with Nicholas about algorithms. This can get really dangerous, and people don't know what they're talking about, and people's lives are at stake. So it's not just a level of ignorance, which, as you said, it's gotten so sophisticated since the time of Scheler, but also the level of practice. This can really turn out badly.
John?
Yeah, just one final remark regarding this problem of materialistic tendencies in Brooks's thought, and what that does to the best personalist insights that he has. Derek said, if the brain is all controlling, then love makes no sense. Quite right. But if love does make sense, then the materialism of the brain makes no sense. So we can take this incompatibility between neurological determinism and love and say, yeah, if if the determinism has the last word, the love is debunked. But if we take love seriously, then we have a point of departure for refuting the neurological determinism. That's the kind of engagement that I would favor and was suggested by Amanda in her comment.
Thank you to our panelists.
Thank you.